So I'm Anthony Lavenda. I direct the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability on campus and teach classes on climate change and climate policy. Thank you all for being here. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Ray today. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that Evergreen State College is on the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island tribe, and it's a privilege and an honor to be guests on this land. With that, I wanted to move into a few just quick notes about admin before we get started introducing Sarah. Will be a talk of about 40-ish minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers after the talk. The talk is being recorded, and that will be shared on Evergreen State College's YouTube presence at some point in the future. There'll also be a link from our website where it's available, evergreen.edu/climate. And I also want you to keep an eye out for future lectures, such as this one, where we'll have guests coming up in week 7 at the same time in this same room from 11:30 to 1. We might move to a smaller lecture hall in the future, but just look out for that information on the Evergreen calendar or in the Inside Evergreen messages you get in your emails if you read those. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Ray here. She's the chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt on Wyatt territory, or Wyatt territory. Ray's current work is at the intersection of justice, climate emotions, and the interplay between inner resilience and collective action. Her book on this research, which I encourage everyone to read, even if you're a faculty member or just anyone interested in climate change and climate action, is called The Field Guide to Climate Anxiety: How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. It's an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Ray's writing on emotions and climate justice has been published very widely in the LA Times, the Scientific American, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, Edge Effects, and many other places. She consults extensively on the topic of climate anxiety and climate justice, and is working on a book titled An Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, which I encourage you all to check out the website with accompanying resources as well. And it offers a professional development, and she offers a professional development workshop to help center emotions in climate work, the Climate Wisdom Lab. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome her for her talk, Climate Justice and the Politics of Emotions today. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you.
I'm going to use this microphone here. Is that working okay? Good. Thanks for the thumbs up. Did you see over here it was an existential cool kit? I like that. It's the book is an existential cool kit. This is fun. Okay. So thank you so much for having me, Anthony. Thanks very much for bringing me to Evergreen State College. I was here a few years ago. Is Dr. Joshi here yet? Yeah, there you are. Hi. Thanks for bringing me last time. It's so nice to be back. It's so good to see you. We went to graduate school together at Oregon. That's really wonderful. So it's really good to be here. So in thinking about this land acknowledgement, I asked Michael and Anthony, are you planning to do that? Should I do that? Because this is sort of standard operating procedure nowadays in any place that I'm in. And they mentioned, we're actually kind of undergoing, rethinking it and really questioning, does it do more harm than good? What are the sort of ethical implications of it? And at my institution, which is now called Cal Poly Humboldt, it should be called Gudini, which would be people among the redwoods. It should be named after in the Wyatt language, the name of the place that it was. But no, we're going with Cal Poly Humboldt instead, because that institution still has not figured out how to decolonize. However, the land acknowledgement that we use for the Wyatt land there, that the campus is on, I would recommend go checking out. Katja Risling-Baldy is the chair of Native American Study, her fantastic video called What Good is a Land Acknowledgement, where she kind of explores some of these tensions and difficulties around what is the point of doing this. One of the reasons to do so is because of the desire to constantly bring up on a regular basis that this history and this presence in the landscape is always experiencing some kind of erasure, and to just mark that all the time, that in mentioning this, we're resisting that erasure. And also, Katja Risling-Baldy would say in her talk, she says one of the most important things that needs to happen with our land acknowledgement is an agreement to some sort of commitment. And so the commitment to action that I'm thinking about when I speak about, whenever I give a talk, I try to think of it new every time and not just have one sort of standard scripted thing. And currently, where my thinking is going when I explored this question this morning, meditating on it, what is the commitment today, right? Every day, it really needs to be every day you think about it, or I feel that way for myself. The commitment that I have been thinking about has to do with what Olufemi Taiwo in his beautiful book, I don't know if you've ever read this book or you have it in your classes, Reconsidering Reparations. Has anybody been reading this book in their class? 2 people. The whole last half of the book is about climate justice, so I recommend it if that's of interest to you. The very, very end of the book, he talks about what he calls the ancestor principle. And in the ancestor principle, which is a beautiful way to end the book, and it really resonated with me, he talked about all of us considering, everybody from all their ancestors, considering what their ancestors have called them to do in this generation, and to use it as an antidote to despair and feelings of powerlessness. That in our simple lifetimes and a short life that we have on this planet, with the minimal power that we have and the small people that we are in our small ways, right? That we feel often a sense of powerlessness and despair that the problems are so big and we can't do anything about it. Does anyone ever feel that way? Everybody right there, just raise your hand. Make me happy. We all know. Thank you. Right, we got a winner here. This sense of powerlessness that we feel often has to do with is often a product of many people are talking about this in indigenous scholarship, in Olufemi Taiwo's book, that the sense of powerlessness really is a product of this other root cause of the climate crisis, which is individualism. And Olufemi Taiwo is saying, okay, hey, ancestor principle recognizes that we're just pushing something along in the short generation that we're alive, and it has been pushing along previous generations. And the question is not what my ancestors are split between people who did some good stuff and some really bad stuff. And so the question is not, do I extend the bad stuff my ancestors did, but what of the things that they were called to do am I going to answer in my lifetime? So I think of that beautiful quote in Taiwo's book. I recommend, you got to get to the end. It's like the last 10 pages of the book where it really gets good for me. Okay, so that's my commitment today. I'm thinking about that because my grandmother just died yesterday. She was 105 years old. That woman had seen a lot of stuff, and she had done some pretty cool stuff in her life. So I'm thinking about my ancestors. Okay. Today, where am I going today? Let me just check to look at my time. This is a new talk for me. I give a book talk typically on the field guide to climate anxiety, but this is a new direction for me. I'm really trying to think about where I'm going next. So thank you for participating in this experiment, this intellectual experiment. And it may mean that I kind of throw a lot of kitchen sink stuff at you and unanswered questions, and I might raise things that I don't actually follow through on. So I'm hoping you'll pick up on those things and maybe bring it up in Q&A. And the slides are also a little bit new. I've only given this talk one time before. So we'll see how this is gonna go. Okay, so just the outline of this. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to research the topic of the title, Climate, Justice, and the Politics of Emotions. What the heck got me to that thing? And I think that's particularly helpful when you're thinking about this stuff from the perspective of a student, because I often think, what got this person caring about this stuff? What's that journey? I actually find it, honestly, more interesting than the content itself, the kind of personal story behind a research question, because we all use research, those of us who do it, as a kind of personal healing project, right? So what the heck is going on with her that she needs to heal something in there, right? So I want to share that with you. And then secondly, why focus on the politics of emotions in a talk about climate justice? I'm going to spend some time on this question. This particular set of questions brings together all of my interests in a way that I haven't really been able to do yet. So it's like I've got all these different interests, but I haven't figured out what the through line between them is, and I'm going to try to come up with some of them today with you. By way of answering that question, I'm going to throw a Venn diagram at you. I'm not a very visual person, and I have no graphic background, but I created a Venn diagram, and I hope it's really compelling. I think it will be. Yeah, she's excited. All right, so why do we need climate justice and emotion all together? I feel like the Venn diagram helps me structure that argument. And then what does this all add up to at this point? Where should we go from here? This is my attempt to make it look all tidy and pretty, but you'll see along the way that it's not, but at least I'll end that way. So very triumphant. No conclusions, no solutions. I do not promise any of that. I am now really loving Vanessa Machado de Oliveira's book, Hospicing Modernity, and I'm not pretending to come up with any solutions. She gave me permission fully in that book. Has anybody read that book? It's fantastic. I recommend it. Okay, no, it's not a very good title. People don't want to pick that one off the shelf, but it is really good. Okay, so the journey, how did I get there? This was my first book, this was my dissertation, right? So this was my attempt. I came from a humanities background. I actually have a BA in religious studies and women's studies, and then an MA in American studies. And during my MA, somebody taught me that maybe if I was really interested in social justice, because at the time what I was really caring about was questions of social justice, social movement theory, social movement history, this kind of stuff. And she said, have you ever considered the environment as a lens through which to understand social justice? And I thought, what are you talking about? Like wilderness? John Muir? How does that have anything to do with anything, right? So she really convinced me that actually the environment was a really useful lens through which to understand social justice. Does that seem like an obvious statement to most of you? Most of you are like, yeah, environment, social justice, they go together? We got some yeses and nos, okay, right? Yeah, I feel like in the last 10 years or so, it is considered kind of normal and the dominant paradigm to think about social justice and environment stuff together. And that is actually a product of young people's social movements in American politics and in American public discourse. So it's really kind of exciting. Like, you never saw the words climate and justice together until the last 10 years, even less than that. The two come together, now it's like in the White House. It's crazy. Like this is radical change happening right before my very eyes. So when I was writing my dissertation back in 03 to 09, I was really thinking about how do we bring these things together? Why haven't they come together? So I had this question, what was the tension between environment and social justice movements? Why is there a big gap between them? How are they at odds with each other, actually in conflict with each other? And so this was my attempt in my dissertation to try to understand that. How does the environmental movement actually work against social justice? That was really the question there. And so this book is an environmental justice. Oh, I'm allowed to do this. This is so cool. Anthony told me I could do this. This book is an environmental justice history of U.S. environmentalism. I don't have to turn around. That's really cool. There's a screen here. That's really cool. So that's really what I attempted to do, to look at where is in environmental history in the U.S. there are moments when environmentalism is actually explicitly anti-social justice. A term that Betsy Hartman has coined called green hate has a long trajectory in U.S. environmentalism, and that still exists in lots of places. It's not totally fringe far right. It's actually pretty dominant in most mainstream environmental conversations still. If you are going to come out of this degree at Evergreen and go out into the world trying to bring social justice and sustainability together in the work that you're doing, you're going to come up against it if you haven't already. And the emotion or the affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, that I was thinking about in this book, I didn't even realize I was engaging in affect theory or affect studies, or even psychology for that matter, was the emotion of environmentalist disgust. Disgust operating to separate people who are worthy of having access to natural resources and the people who are not worthy of it, or who might, as Simon Ortiz talks about it, as become sacrifice people or sacrifice zones. And we can think about this example right now. I'm thinking about, just off the top of my head, current news events. We're thinking about Nepalese people who have had, who are getting human trafficked because the health of kidneys is so bad because of climate change and overwork and bad medical access. And there's a thread right there that connects social justice to environmental issues that lets certain types of people be designated as sort of sacrifice people. And so I wanted to know, how does disgust permit environmentalists to do this to some people, right? So this was really interesting. This was my interest. This is my orientation towards environmental studies was through this justice lens. And then something started to happen around circa 2013, where I think at the time I was like, I'm shifting my research agenda completely away from these justice questions, and I want to think about how are my students going to get through college, because some stuff was happening with my students. I don't know, did anybody who's been teaching for a while, did this feel like this was happening? Yeah, like something shifted. In environmental studies classes, I've been teaching environmental studies since 2003 or something, and then leading environmental studies programs since I got out of my graduate program, and all of a sudden, whammo, my students were not okay. And so what was happening? This is a Valentine from my class, a student. they were trying to be funny and fun, but this was like a wake-up call. Am I doing something wrong in my classes? And so I wanted to know what is going on. What am I doing wrong? What needs to change? What's going on with them? Are they just snowflakes, right? I mean, there's all this literature out there about the snowflakes in the college and all this stuff. So for example, one of my students, I do all this sort of like, how are you feeling about stuff? I'm not sure why I chose this major. It's so depressing. Anybody else feel that way? Like everything you talk about is just, well, Aldo Leopold famously says, if you're going to work in natural resources, you're walking around in a world of wounds, right? I'm walking in a world of ghosts. My heart breaks in every class. I feel guilty and hopeless. I fight with my family. I can't understand why nobody else seems as paralyzed as I do by this despair. What's the point of doing anything? How many of you have felt this way in a low moment? Yeah, I feel that way every day. Yeah, it was heavy. It was starting to be really heavy, and it started to be chronic. It wasn't just one-off students. And then you look at that against the background of mental health landscape for young people in general, and you have this question that arises, well, is it the particular historical moment we're living in? Is it something else? Is it all the social media stuff? Like, what is the cause of this mental health crisis in young people? Well, then I decided what I needed to do. What I needed to do was go write a book about it, and during the writing of the book about it, the youth climate strikes happened around the world. And then I realized, oh no, it's not just my like Humboldt students. This is a global phenomenon, and we can talk about the data on that in Q&A if you're interested. But so something changed, and I started to realize something's wrong with mainstream environmental education. What's wrong with it? Well, I started to study it and started to examine my own assumptions about what thought I was supposed to be doing with students. Many of us educators think that our job is to get people scared enough in our classrooms to care, to do something, right? The assumption being, if we just give them this litany of all the terrible things that are happening in the world, the science, right, that they will then get shocked and upset, and then it'll fix all our problems, right? So that's what I call the scare to care pedagogy, right? And most mainstream environmental education still operates like this. I also thought that my job was to just give my students all the arguments they needed to have to go argue with everybody else and change everybody else's minds, especially around questions of justice. So the thing about most environmental studies students at the time that I started teaching was that they were predominantly white, fairly privileged, and did not have an awareness around how it is that their environmentalism was caught up in all that privilege and actually reinforced a lot of social injustice, which of course was my book project, right? The first book. So I was thinking, I'm doing such a great job. I'm just tearing apart their cherished beliefs in wilderness and whatever, and making them rethink nature and all this stuff. And this was also existentially difficult for students, but I was willing to do that, right? I was arming them and usually got them kind of converted into a more justice-oriented environmental paradigm, which I always felt, okay, that's good. Okay, I'm doing good. Armed them to argue. Well, what happened was they'd often go home during winter break or fall break or whatever and come back and want to talk about how they've just ruined all their family relationships. Because they went to college, got full of all these ideas I'm teaching them, and they go home and have all these fights with Uncle Bob or whatever. And I used to think, who cares about Uncle Bob, right? But I've come a long way. I care about Uncle Bob now. I'll explain to you in a minute. The paradigm of education has often been, especially in the sciences, that information matters more than emotion, in getting students to learn, in teaching them how it is to change other people's minds. I was even teaching composition for the first 5 years of my PhD because I had an English background, and that was the bread and butter for a lot of English PhDs. You teach composition. And in composition, students want to know how to argue with facts, right? Because they have this assumption that facts is what change people's minds. Turns out this is not true. There's a lot of really cool research on this, that emotions determine behavior far more than facts do. We like to think that we're so rational. That's just because we fetishize reason. That's not actually because people make decisions and do anything based on reason, which is what psychologists can show us. And I was like, psychology, they should have been teaching me how to be a teacher a long time ago. But most people get a PhD, nothing to do with how students learn, how people make decisions, how to change the world. They just get full of all this content, and then in the Paulo Freire banking model of education, go dump it on all of you guys like I am right now. Which is my way of saying, I'm not doing a very good job right now teaching. Okay, banking model of students as receptacles. Y'all are empty, deficit model, you have nothing, you're like a blank slate, and then I'm the one with the PhD, and you all sit in these solid chairs and on this like stadium situation, and sage on the stage, right? And that's also not a justice-oriented way of thinking about education either. Prioritizing content knowledge and individual success over relationships and existential wisdom and tools. So this is another thing that most environmental education still does, right? You're gonna be problem solvers and go out and put a solar panel on the roofs of everybody or whatever, you know? And so this sort of really pragmatic approach to some of the environmental sciences, for the environmental studies, more in the humanities, it was very much more about the kind of stuff I was just talking about, thinking differently, thinking about different paradigms about nature. Never, ever, ever questioning or challenging or thinking about how it is that we have individual grades, not here, slightly different, right, Evergreen, but at Cal Poly Humboldt, right? This sort of individual in the seat has their own relationship with the professor, and your job is to get your degree and go off in the world and be your individual self, right? So going back to that point I made earlier about individualism, our pedagogy reinforces it in general. Okay. And this one really chaps my hide, so don't even get me started on it, because obviously there's more words on this. There's more words on these slides than usual, because again, like I said, it's new ideas for me. As I give this talk a lot more, I'll cut out a lot of the words too, but this helps me keep myself, what is it I'm trying to say here? An over-focus on training students to succeed in the existing economy. Jobs, 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 right? That's what's gonna save all these universities in this neoliberal moment, right? We gotta become, we gotta serve the market. But this really limits academia's potential to train students to change the existing system. As Vanessa Machado de Oliveira talked about, hospicing this modernity that is not serving anybody. So at my institution, there's a real debate between people who think we gotta make sure that these students have jobs in the existing economy, the Green New Deal, blah, 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 versus people who think the existing system is on its way out. So what are we training students for? Right? What kind of jobs are they going to get when this system crumbles, right? So this is a real tension within, I think, a lot of institutions right now, and certainly I feel that way as an environmental studies educator. And finally, the thing that got me where I started, right, where I started with my new research project was a failure to consider climate change's effects on students' mental health. And increasingly, that's not just abstract, that's not just about anticipatory anxiety about what might happen in the future, or maybe I won't have kids because the world will be uninhabitable, right? Increasingly, it's, no, I'm actually experiencing climate change itself right now, right? I'm in California, y'all have had it here, right? There is climate change happening right in our backyards. So, yeah, this is just a short list. There are probably a lot of others you can think of too, and I'd love to hear them. Okay, so I started to think, oh my gosh, how am I perpetuating these things? Everything, all the things I was doing, I had to rethink it. What does this do to students? And how does it affect their ability to actually face this polycrisis? This is a new word for all of these different intertwined crises, right? Polycrisis of our times. And I would argue, I mean, you probably have some answers in your own head, but I argue not at all. Right? Terrible, bad, no, terrible stuff, right? Like that model of education is not for this moment, is what I was starting to realize. So instead I started to ask this question, okay, if they can't even come to class, it's so depressing, how are they gonna walk across the graduation stage and then go and solve all these problems that I'm telling them about? Because they're not even coming to class, right? They're like so depressed. And then COVID happened, don't even go there, right? There might be more bodies in this room right now of that, right? This sort of energy to engage in this way. We are strapped, we're burned out, right? We're exhausted from all this stuff. So what is the emotional set of tools? And I was asking this question, thinking this before COVID happened, and then COVID, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna burn out myself, I need my own tools, right? So I actually wrote the book for students, but then literally COVID happened, I was like reading the book thinking, wow, I should probably apply some of these in my own life. So you can, I assure you that I have practiced what I'm preaching, although I hadn't when I wrote the book. So there are parts of the book that feel a little bit to me like, I wish I'd written that better now that I've had to do that, you know? Anyway, so I wrote this book, right? What do these students need? They don't need to figure out how to build a solar panel. They need some existential tools, a cool kit, if you will. To embrace life in the Anthropocene, to get schooled on the role of emotions in climate justice work. Nobody thinks about emotions. Everyone thinks about arguments and ideas. To cultivate climate wisdom. And in here, I even talk quite a bit about death, which is not really something people want to talk about, but that's part of wisdom, right? So I think it's a pretty cool concept. I actually really like talking about it, so you want to talk about it? Talk to me. Yeah, we got one in the back, yay! This is not a death denier, right? There are lots of people who talk about how death denial is actually the root cause of our climate crisis, so we can explore that if you want. Claim your calling and scale your action. This really is the question of the thing I opened with, the ancestor principle. Why do we feel so powerless? How can we think differently about this and not feel so powerless? Hacking the story is related. This has to do with living in the stories that we consume about what's happening with the climate and whether we might want to think about living in different stories. Be less right and more in relation goes back to Uncle Bob, right? I was like, wait, hang on. Maybe this isn't about arming students with arguments so they can be right. Maybe this is about teaching them how to be in relationship. And that blew my mind. What are we doing right now to be in relationship with each other? Not a whole lot, right? I'm not doing much right now. I'm just telling you it's a good idea. And I'm gonna help you, tell you just go and do it later, right? But this is not a relationship building experience. I'm stating the obvious. Ditching guilt, moving beyond hope, and laughing more. This chapter really explores a variety of different emotions that may not have been the dominant ones that we think about when we think about the environmental movement. Environmental movement has used which emotions predominantly to get people to do things? Fear. Anything else? Shame, guilt. Guilt's a favorite one, right? Fear, shame, guilt, right? So what's up with guilt? What's up with hope? What's up with laughter and love and joy? Things that we don't think about when we think about the environmental movement. Anyway, that's what that chapter is about. And I really wanted to focus on this chapter on burnout, on the unique capacity among climate activists for burnout. It is like a really honed skill. So I want to speak to when you feel like you're on this planet to redeem the impact of your life on this planet, you don't ever sleep, you know? So that shame is so deep. And so why do we need to not do that to ourselves? And this chapter, Feed What You Want to Grow, is my favorite personal one. This is my go-to one when I'm feeling terrible. Based on Adrienne Maree Brown's work, one of her principles of emergent strategy. If you're anybody familiar with Adrienne Maree Brown's work, a couple people, yeah, great. Emergent strategy, pleasure activism, some great books out there. She's wonderful. And she basically says, when you're feeling like shit about everything, look to what's good and nurture that, right? Because there's two ways to fix the world. There's two ways to solve problems. One is to get rid of the bad stuff, and another way is to grow the good stuff. And we spend way too much time, because of our negativity biases, trying to fix the bad stuff, trying to change the bad stuff. Seeing it, we learn really well in college in particular how to be critical. In fact, critique is actually a form of love and care if you can do it right, right? But that kind of seeing all the negatives, seeing the terrible, can also have this backfiring effect of debilitating us. And Adrienne Brown argues, feed what you want to grow, focus the energy on feeding what you want to grow. And one way I get there is I say, when I'm feeling really terrible in the doom scrolling mode I get into, oh, the world's going to hell, polycrisis, I'm powerless, all that, right, that stuff. I go, what else is true? Oh, right, there's all this other stuff, right? All this other stuff. It just doesn't make the news. This goes back to the chapter on stories. So this is what I tried to do, right? I thought, I didn't do teaching right. I never learned how to teach. We're in a new moment. What the hell do these students need? Because it's not working, what we've been doing. So this is what I tried to do in this book. But here's what happened in this book. This is where I'm shifting gears, right? Up until now, I've been talking about what I've already done. Now I'm going to turn gears and think, what do I try to do next? Why focus on politics of emotion and climate emotions research? So here are some ideas I'm just going to throw at you. It's awesome, and I love talking about how to cope, how to manage. But I also want to think there's a tension within emotions research and sort of self-care logic in general, in spiritual practices. A lot of debates happen around between you are just taking the luxury and time of focusing on yourself and looking inward, right? It's called spiritual bypass or whatever, and not actually attending to what's happening in the world. Your suffering is actually a result of terrible systems in the world, and you should be changing the systems, not yourself, right? So there's this tension. Some people say, like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, oh no, you can't change the world until you change yourself, right? So there's debate happening. Does anybody have that debate in themselves too? Like, I don't have time for myself. I got to fix all these problems. Or no, I can't fix any of these problems until I fix myself, right? That tension. So I want to kind of try to get to, answer that question, get to that a little bit more by thinking about how we might use emotions for political change, right? That the interior world and the exterior world are intimately linked. And similarly, what I call the mental healthification of climate emotions is in this comic right here, this idea that the way we solve our inner world problems is by going to therapy rather than changing political systems, right? Because that is, of course, the neoliberal idea of mental health. It medicalizes it. It individualizes it. It's what they call pathologizes it. That's your problem. You have a problem. You're not adjusted to the world. Go get adjusted with your therapist, right? This is not to dismiss therapy, right? But to say that there's an argument here that needs to be pushed back on, in my view. And this is not about how does climate change affect our mental health. The vast majority of research right now is on this question. How is climate change going to affect mental health? It's a very valid question, wonderful question. I love it. Somebody else is researching it. I don't want to research that question. I've done enough research on that question. That's not an interesting question to me anymore. As much. I love it, but it's not the most interesting question. I want to ask instead, what is the phenomenon of climate anxiety revealing about this historical moment? It's a very different question, and I hope that my Venn diagram will start to explore some of that. And there's, of course, a diversity gap in the research. So the research I relied on to write my book was very much, okay, the 75% of our subjects are, white, middle class, 60% female, you know what I'm saying? And when you don't disaggregate research, you miss all kinds of really interesting stories about inequality, about history, all kinds of stuff. So with my colleague Jade Sasser, who's at UC Riverside, I'm trying to explore all these questions. What happens when you think about these questions from really different angles? And I hope to get a little bit at that today. Okay, so that's kind of, where I'm starting at. Is this all clear to everybody before I move on? Oh, good. Who knows? I don't know. Am I in the weeds in my head, or is this actually intelligible? I don't know. Okay, so why is understanding the politics of emotions so important for climate justice? Wait, what's the politics of emotions? First things first. What do I mean by the politics of emotions? We often think about politics in terms of big capital P, like something that happens down the road at your state capitol or at the White House or like representatives, right? That's when I think of politics, I think of, I'm not into politics. I don't do that. I don't like that. Those people are evil. No, sorry. Did I say that out loud? I don't want to do that, right? That stuff is freaking me out. But politics, lowercase p, for people who study sort of cultural politics, is the stuff that is happening every day. There's a politics of the geography of this room. There's a politics to everything you're wearing. There's a politics to what you drive or don't drive. There's a politics to your accent, right? There's a politics to absolutely everything. So when I think about politics, I'm thinking lowercase p, all of this stuff that makes up power dynamics in our daily lives, okay? And emotions shape that, right? Emotion shapes all that. And politics shape emotions. So this dynamic interplay between how emotions are in fact, very public. Even if we think on our own head or heart or wherever we think our emotions are, off in some other universe. Okay, so do you see what I'm saying about what I mean by politics of emotion? It's not like what, Nancy Pelosi's feeling right now, okay? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the stuff that's actually mattering in our daily lives. So this wonderful New York Times, sort of series of pieces came out fairly recently that blew my mind, because it was the first time I had heard people talking about this in a really public way, that the mental health crisis of our times is very political, right? Instead of just throwing, Daniel Carr wrote this beautiful piece, I recommend checking it out. Instead of just throwing resources at psychiatric services, solving the mental health crisis will require fighting for people to have secure access to things that buffer them from chronic stress. Housing, food security, education, childcare, job security, the right to organize for more humane workplaces, right? And imminent, thank you for adding this one, imminent climate apocalypse, action on that important detail, right? So we see the poly crisis here laid out as the source of the mental health crisis. Great. This is a conversation I want to see happening more. Glenn Albrecht is a fantastic, interesting philosopher in Australia. He says the same thing about climate emotions, more specifically. He says the thing that causes your negative emotional state is what needs to be changed, not you. You don't need therapy. You don't need any form of coping mechanism, not even an extra glass of wine. I like that one. What you need is a political understanding of the cause of your lack of solace. This is what I mean by the politics of emotion. Okay? And a lot of times that work is internal. It doesn't happen in a political, arena. So but there are politics to it, right? That's what I'm trying to say. And we have this idea that if we're not accommodated to the world, and we have negative emotional states, or what they call, distress, he calls it psychoterratic experiences, that there's something wrong with us, right? And he's trying to say, no. You actually are having a reasonable response to what's happening in the world. And so there's a real call within the climate emotions community to say, all these climate emotions they can't get dealt with in the therapy room. They got to be political, right? And so we think about something like this concept of public feelings, a little mini bibliography here of books that explore this in the world of what's called affect theory. Thinking about emotions as political, emotions as a social and political subject of analysis, not a medicalized condition, or not just a medicalized condition. Rather than a disease that plagues the individual, emotion is seen as a political and social phenomenon. That's what I'm trying to do in this next layer of work, right? Because when people talk about climate anxiety, which was the subject of my last book, there's always questions, Sarah, what's the 5 coping strategies? As if managing or fixing it is the point. And as if we can take climate anxiety as a stable category that we can accept without being thoughtful about it to begin with, right? So I'm trying to just peel some of those layers apart here. So what does this mean for where I'm trying to go? I want to ask, what cultural and political work does the idea of climate anxiety do, right? Why now? Why is 2019 the year that the OED accepted climate anxiety as a word in that dictionary? What's happening, right? Is it just because climate change is getting worse and people are feeling it more? Maybe. But there's something else going on, too. And I'm not going to answer that question today, but I want us to be thinking about it, right? Let's get critical about what climate even is, what anxiety even is, and why these words are resonating, right? A lot of preconditions have to be met for this to be so happening, right? So what are those preconditions? Instead of just this question, how do we cope, right? That's a cool question, and I'm happy to talk about that. I love that conversation. But I'm going a different direction here. Okay, so I got a Venn diagram. Who's excited? All right, these are the 3 themes of the Venn diagram. Obviously, I'm going to try to make the case that there's a sweet spot, right there in the middle that we want to aim for, right? Okay, so what's going on here? What happens when we have just climate emotions? What's missing when we ignore the justice lens and we just think about climate and emotions together? This tunnel vision graphic gives us a really good example of this. If we just think about carbon emissions as the only thing that's causing our problem, we miss out on a whole suite of solutions. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who ask me this, right? Like, wouldn't we solve all the problems if we just got carbon out of the atmosphere? Yes and no. It's complicated, right? So it's kind of tunnel vision of just thinking about, let's just fix the climate problem and then we won't have any climate anxiety. Yeah, cool, but also when you start to go down this path, you realize it's not just about climate change and anxiety, right? It's about so many other things. It's tangled up in so much other stuff. The polycrisis there. Okay, also what's wrong when we miss the justice lens? This move towards pathologizing climate emotions is really the dominant move that's happening right now. So we think about this article that came out a little bit earlier, which was basically like, hey, oh, look what's happening. Climate change is showing up in people's therapy rooms. And there's a whole new cottage industry of therapists that are becoming climate aware. And the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America is out there trying to help people. And there's all kinds of stuff that's just blooming everywhere around getting therapists more cognizant of climate change so that they can help their clients better. This is wonderful. I love it. I'm a big fan. But it misses this whole other thing, right? And of course, I know I've actually spoken to many of these climate psychologists. They know that too. They feel limited in their profession to do the kind of political work that has to happen. So there's a fundamental problem here with the mental health industry, of privatizing this. Another factor that I'm really enjoying exploring with Jade Sasser and a couple other colleagues is this kind of whitewashing of climate emotions research. So the vast majority of data that we see about how many people feel climate anxiety, how many people are feeling worried or concerned, coming out of things like the Yale Center for Climate Communication, they're generally speaking these sort of disaggregated pools of people, without thinking about why certain communities might experience different types of emotions in different ways, or why different types of communities might even not perceive climate change to be a problem or a risk. This goes to risk perception theory. So there's all kinds of really interesting questions when we start to peel back the layers of the onion around what the heck is this thing, climate anxiety? Who even gets to perceive climate change as a problem? Something like 6% of the world's population has even heard of the term. There's a lot more people than 6% who are feeling climate change. So try to get your head around that, right? How do you not even know what you're feeling, right? When your house is having to be moved because of rising sea levels and you don't even know climate change is, does that mean you don't have climate anxiety and we should ignore you, or you think that you're somehow suspect? Not at all, right? Or Jade Sasser's work is very much about why it is that the conversation around young people's desire or not desire to have children, it differs according to demographic, right? Who is actually saying that and for what reasons, right? Why is existential threat of climate change more pronounced in African American women between 16 and 25 than it is in any other demographic, for example? Right? So it's just what happens when you start to ask these questions across different axes of difference. Right? Just a very different conversation comes up, and the dominant stories about what we ought to do about climate anxiety shifts a lot, and it's really important. So who perceives climate as a threat? What do different communities perceive as the greatest risks? I can't tell you how many communities I've been in who are experiencing terrible environmental justice problems and say, my problem has to do with this incinerator next to my neighborhood. We don't care about climate change, right? So there's a job to say, oh, that's climate change too. It's going to get worse by climate change. So yeah, you do really care about climate change. No, right? No, they're articulating a different threat. Right? Or you have a very Republican community and farming community in Idaho who's saying, we don't do climate change, but we can't grow our potatoes anymore. Right? I've been in those classrooms where I've had students be like, oh, you climate change, left coasty weirdo, Sarah, but we have these other problems. And I go, yeah, right. And in my head, I can connect dots between that and climate change, but is that how I'm going to talk to this person? No, right? Because risk perception is deeply entrenched in our identity. And it takes a certain level of ability to let go of thinking it's all climate change, tunnel vision, to get into all these different perspectives on what people actually perceive as a threat. And people perceive things as a threat not because there's water on their doorway. They perceive it because of what their neighbor tells them and what stories they live in. That's what the research shows on that. That's fascinating. That's why we can have people dying of COVID who say, it's not COVID, right? So what stories we live in matter greatly. What emotions are culturally available for different types of people? So I haven't talked about this yet. This is super cool research too. There's all this really cool research on how it is that there used to be this thought that emotions were universal. And no matter who you ask across the world, if you showed them a face that looked like this, everybody could say, oh, that person's confused, right? Confusion is the emotion on their face. But it turns out this research is not true. Right? That there's so many preconditions that have to happen before we even feel an emotion. So one person in one part of the world, one gender, one religion, one whatever, depending on who you are, you will have a different suite of emotions accessible to you that you can express safely than another person in a different historical moment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So emotions are not universal. They're very much produced by our conditions. What we've been told since we were infants, we are allowed and safe to feel, what languages we have access to describe those things, right? All that stuff. All those layers have to happen before we even have a feeling. That's so cool. But it means that the research really needs to be attendant to this wide range of human emotion. That's why I have this picture here. I don't know, for some reason it gets there for me. And the research on climate emotions needs to be disaggregated. And it has not been. It's really not been. It's so new, nobody's doing this yet. So if you're interested in a research project, yeah, you'd be producing original research. What the heck is going on right there? Yeah.
To what end must it be disaggregated?
To what end? Okay, so
Towards having more accurate and useful
Yeah.
data points?
Absolutely.
Or is it a matter of representation in and of itself being worthwhile, even if it doesn't lead to useful data points?
I would say both for sure, right? But the implications are, if you say that climate anxiety is causing people, and you generally say people, young people, let's say, to feel a particular emotion that then needs this particular therapeutic intervention. Those therapeutic interventions are, and what we think of as the thing to solve the problem, are going to be very different depending on how it is that we come up with those conclusions and detect that evidence. And so, for example, I've had faculty who say to me, oh, you know, I think my students really feel guilty. I have a lot of guilt in my classrooms. And so I'm going to do this and that assignment to try to address my student guilt. Well, it turns out if they disaggregate their students' emotions, they'll find that mostly the guilt is clustered around their white students, and other emotions are clustered around other different populations of students, right? So if you approach and then recenter the white students' experience in that classroom, assuming guilt as the dominant emotion, which if your classroom is predominantly white, it would be, right? Then you are, in fact, once again erasing the experience of these other students, which actually could be extremely instructive for the rest of the class. So that's in a classroom setting example. Same goes for psychology research, right? So if you take as universal one population's experience and then generate solutions from that data, you're gonna have problems, right? And the same, I mean, this has happened in terms of sexuality, gender, all kinds of things in scientific research for since forever, right? Since scientific research was a thing. So yeah, so when you generalize and then come up with solutions from that. This is a really good question, thank you. Yeah, why would you do it? Well, for that reason, because the solutions that we want to come up with, we want to make sure that they don't just reinforce the problems. Okay, right, and there's another question that I find super interesting too, because it's not super simple. I had a lot of people tell me in climate justice circles, actually this concept of one particular emotion, climate anxiety, is really useful for mobilizing across difference, because people from all over the world can say, we feel this thing, let's go to court about it, right? Because that's what's actually happening in lots of places in the world. People have used climate anxiety as a human rights law, moral injury concept to go and force their government leaders to take action. It's a really cool concept of using emotions to change politics. And it is working. It's super cool, right? So there's an argument to be made there that one term does, in fact, have a mobilizing effect. But it also can erase important nuances, like we just talked about right there with your great question. So yeah, it's complicated. So who feels climate anxiety? You might think that the answer to this is, 76%. I just read it in the article, the other day, right? Or you might think anybody who's on this planet ought to be feeling climate anxiety, right? What are some of the other answers you might be thinking to this question? Not me. I'm cool, right? So who feels it? Well, I tried to, my first attempt at trying to tease all this apart came with this really simplest answer to this is it really depends on who perceives it as a threat and what anxiety even means to them. So going to this point of even both of these terms need to be unpacked. Also, there's another dimension of climate anxiety that people haven't really been talking about. When you add the justice dimension in, there is an aspect of big ecological emotions, big environmentalist emotions that have actually been deployed for greater harm and more violence. And psychologists call this emotional diversion, right? There's a problem going on, you're being told you should have a lot of fear by all these environmentalists, right? And so what do? right? So there is a long thread of history here that we see manifested in current politics, happening more and more and more, not at all fringe, not at all rare, based on neo-Malthusian ideas of scarcity of resources and a particular population threatening that resource, right? And so uses actually social Darwinism as an argument to think about which populations ought to be in charge of resources, right? So we see concepts like in Buffalo, the Great Replacement Theory coming up, white extinction anxiety, and of course this has roots in the Christchurch, the El Paso shootings, where the manifesto is even quotes Al Gore's movie, right? So there's a direct link to climate anxiety in a lot of the violence that's happening in this moment. So historical violence is dead in the name of eco-anxieties too, right? So there's an argument, most people are thinking about how do I cope with it? I want to save all these problems in the world. How do I, unleash my potential to do that and not be beset by burnout? That's usually the conversation I'm having with people. This conversation also is missing unless we add the justice dimension. Where is this coming from? This comes from manifest destiny, right? In the US, there's a long history of this, which then fueled, after Darwin wrote stuff and a bunch of scientists decided to take it up, a history of eugenics in the US, which then, of course, was taken up by Adolf Hitler in Germany around the concept of Lebensraum, or elbow room, right? That somehow, once the frontier in the US was closed and there's no more land, that the democratic experiment of America would be lost, right? And so we need to get more land, right? And so Hitler was like, this is great idea. Get rid of certain people, get more land. That's soil and blood ideology. Of course, this comes up in the 1960s in the US with Paul Ehrlich's famous book that blew open the 1960s version of this in US environmental history with a real fear and fetish around overpopulationism, which still is experienced. Oh, I see a hand raised there. Yeah.
I had a thing that was kind of like related to this. I noticed say even like in biology textbook I have and stuff like that they go into like overpopulation. There's kind of like this scapegoating of like first world countries onto third world countries about like, oh well, if they develop then we won't have resources or they have overpopulation. I don't know. It's kind of interesting with that, and I've seen it in like philosophical like notebook type thing. Just like even though really it's like the top however percent that's causing a lot of damage, is kind of like, oh well, it's their problem. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so there's a real, political ecologists call that the environment poverty paradigm, right? That somehow poverty means that you're not good for the environment. An assumption, right? Great, thank you for bringing that up, because of course it has implications for development theory, for sure. That's something that Dr. Joshi could give a whole lecture on too. And of course, the result of this is the potential for a lot of eco-emotions to fuel what Betsy Hartman has called green hate, which I'm going to zip through this slide because I want to get to my other parts of my Venn diagram, right? So what is loss without a justice lens? We treat the symptoms, not the causes. We pathologize emotions. We depoliticize emotions, right? We ignore how all this suffering is shaping politics and caused by structural failures. The emotions research gets whitewashed. The vocabulary and notions of risk perception vary widely across communities. We don't take that into account. And it fails to connect these big eco-emotions with violence. So this is the summary of what I just said. And I'm faster through these other ones. That was the big one. So how do we bring a more justice-oriented lens to thinking about climate emotions? Well, instead of climate, you'll see here that we are more granular about naming the problem. And over here about emotions, we're more granular about thinking about the different emotions. Okay, so what does putting climate and justice together help us do? This is going to be more obvious to you all. I'm going to go through it real quick. Those the least responsible are the first to experience climate problems, right? We know climate and justice. Costs of growth are borne by the most vulnerable. This is why we hear loss and damage being brought up in COP. The extension of the colonial worldview, what Olufemi Taiwo calls global racial capital or global racial empire, this notion that the colonial worldview that's causing all these different forms of oppression historically are the same root cause of climate change, this analysis. Not all climate change solutions are just. And inequality worsens and is worsened by climate change. These are the kinds of analyses you can do when you put those two things together. And it's awesome. But what happens when we take out the emotion lens, right? Emotions dictate our actions more than logic. So how are we going to mobilize a climate justice movement if we don't understand emotion? How are we going to get those ideas on that previous slide actually implemented in policy and in the public sphere if we don't understand how people make decisions and why people change behavior or reckon with these kinds of things? I love Donella Meadows' argument here. This is her, speaking of icebergs, right? This is just a visual image to understand that the greatest impact, if we think about, if we're sitting there pondering, how can I have the greatest impact in the world? What career should I have to have the greatest impact? What sector should I work in? Where are the theories of change out there that can work? Donella Meadows is an economist, right? I always think, isn't capitalism the biggest one? Like where the money goes is where it's going to make change? No, even an economist says mindsets, the way people think, worldviews, has the greatest impact. Well, that works for me because I work in the world of culture change and I'm not an economist and I don't deal with that stuff. So I'm like, yes, go Donella Meadows, right? Similar to this, right? This is not systems theory, right? She's thinking in systems, going to see what's the root cause of the whole system and getting to that root cause at the bottom of the iceberg, right? Tunnel vision, most climate doesn't think about this larger system. Paul Hawkins says, the most complex radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. What would happen if we actually invested in the heart and mind to change in these ways as much as we put into green technology? It'd be radical. I'm waiting for that. But right, there's like science, not to use science to make an argument, but there's science to back this up, lots of science. It's just not the dominant model. So what happens when we combine emotions and justice? Well, this is where it gets fun. I start to move towards the conclusion. I know you're waiting for me to be over here. Okay, what can communities that have faced many existential threats teach us about the climate movement? So that's really what Mariana Heglar and a lot of people who are sort of big voices in the climate justice movement are saying, hey, climate movement, previously very white climate movement, this is an existential threat to you, but there are other people who've done lots of social movements who've faced existential threats before. You may want to pay attention to them a little bit, center their experiences a little bit more. So what are they calling for? Things like capacity for resilience, and by resilience, I mean, along with Adrienne Brown, the capacity to continue to work despite setbacks. The focus on relationships, an awareness, an epistemological awareness of interconnectedness, and an ethic of care, as opposed to, I won't even describe the opposite, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Hope or faith, some people call this a spiritual relationship to the work, but basically the capacity for uncertainty. It doesn't have to be spiritual, but the capacity for uncertainty is what some people define as hope. Trauma-informed activism, this intertwined notion that the healing of the self and the healing of society are interlinked, right? And that we can't have one without the other. A connection to a larger purpose. Coalition building strategies, right? There's not a purity politics in most coalition building. People make compromises. People talk to people they feel really angry about, right? In order for people who have really had to do a lot of history of fighting to get anywhere, they've had to talk to people that make them mad, right? Coalition building. Systems thinking. This goes to Donella Meadows' point. Not just carbon emissions, solve that problem. The necessity for joy, pleasure, and feelings of solidarity. So a real focus on the heart, not just the mind or the hand, right? Heart, hand, and head are these sort of 3 H's that people talk about. In college, mostly we're head and maybe a little bit of hand, action, right? Like teach them how to do stuff, right? And the heart is really missing. So activist movements have long centered emotion. And again, this point I made earlier about an ancestor perspective that takes us beyond the self. Some examples of this, Adrienne Brown, she writes, we have to make justice the most pleasurable experience humans can have. She's using neuroscience to make this case. She's not just saying, oh, I like pleasure, so we should just make it fun. No, she's saying the brain is a pleasure-seeking machine, and people will sign up for this stuff more than they're doing now if they don't think that it's going to hurt. And she's the queen of this, so I recommend checking out her fantastic book, Pleasure Activism. Tricia Hersey just came out with a book in October called Rest is Resistance. She writes, this is about more than naps. We are attempting to disrupt a toxic system that ties our worth to how much we produce. Our bodies do not belong to capitalism. We know better, rest and resist. So these are the kinds of insights we can get from people who are standing on the shoulders of social movements. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, has anybody here read this one? Brady's Week, she maybe even came here, I don't know. She's making her rounds, being a MacArthur genius and all that. She's fantastic. Brady's Week, even a wounded world is feeding us, even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. Again, this larger than self, non-instrumentalist hope. Audre Lorde, of course, famously, probably familiar with this famous quote, talking about caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So, we should be in the sweet spot. You've seen what's missing when we miss out on one of these other things, right? How do we do that? I'm not quite sure what is allowed to this point. Final slide here. Emotions are political. They shape every aspect of our lives. They take on a new dimension when we consider it in climate justice work. We should learn to understand how emotions undergird all behavior in politics. Fear, guilt, dread, and powerlessness, these are partly responses to how bad things are, but they're also benefiting the extractive systems that are causing the problem in the first place. So it really is not in service to ourselves or to social justice or climate to dwell in those feelings, right? Be critical about the cultural production of different emotions. Consider how dominant forces like media can add to or proliferate or even police different emotions in different people and communities. The most obvious example here is this notion that anger in Black women is much worse politically than in a white woman, but a white woman can't do it as good as a white man, right? So anger as an emotion resonates differently across, in the US context in this historical moment. Then, you see, taking identity and positionality into account has to happen. So the cultural production of emotions, it's not just universal. We don't just all feel anger and it's all equal. So emotions are produced in context. Do the work on ourselves to learn how emotions operate on us and how our emotions and decisions are conditioned by culture. So if we do that work on ourselves, we can see the filters we've been conditioned by a little bit better. Tricia Hersey says, don't donate your body to capitalism. She's like, don't donate your energy, your time, your money, whatever you have control over, which is actually a lot, don't donate it. That's beautiful the way I love that idea. Kyle Powers White's a Potawatomi philosopher at University of Michigan. He talks about crisis epistemology. We talked about fear earlier, dominating the climate movement, very much based on this assumption that if we get urgency, fomented, people will get to action faster. But I'm suggesting the opposite here based on the psychological research. It's actually a recipe for ecofascism and green hate. And of course, urgency, this is me again a little bit, my little self-helpy side. Urgency is grind culture eating you from the inside out. It is. Doesn't that feel like that? Yeah, when you get urgency, we're out. And it's disguised as care, right? So when we feel that sense of care, how else would I do it? And haste is a form of escapism. That's Nietzsche. I'm going to just cite Nietzsche right there. Keep caring. Psychic numbing and nihilism don't solve the climate crisis. They certainly don't help you. Okay, they're bullhorns calling us to a life of purpose and joy. And I think that's it. You want to know more? We got a conference coming up on this topic. Half of it's going to be virtual. Registration's coming out soon. Follow me on Twitter and I'll get this going for you, or email me. Jennifer Atkinson came and talked to you all a couple months ago. She and I are doing a book on this for educators. That's coming out. Check it out. And Venn diagrams are cool. There's actually a whole activist movement that comes up with vent diagrams. That's like a cool kit. So vent diagrams on climate, you should check it out, ventdiagrams.com. I just wanted to end on that because I did some Venn diagrams, and these are even better. Thank you very much. I'd love to have some time for Q&A. If there is some, please tell me there is. Aren't those good Venn diagrams? Yes. Check them out. You gotta check out the website, there's lots. This is just the climate ones. So time for Q&A, do we have any?
Plenty.
Okay, oh good, okay.
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes.
Oh good, yay,
Yeah.
good.
So whoever's ready for questions for Professor Ray.
I threw a lot of stuff at you guys, I know, sorry.
We have one over here.
One over here, yeah.
One over here.
Thanks, Anthony.
What role do you think that the educated climate scientist professional should have in leadership of a movement? Should it be of the leader itself or of a delegate and advisor?
I'm going to just assume I understand the detail of your question and go with my instinct on it. One of the problems that we've seen, and I'm going to go on my own little pivot here, one of the problems we see in climate science and climate education in general when it's dominated in the sciences, which it generally is in most institutions, actually in most tables where decisions are made, right? That's why California State University Humboldt is now Polytechnic, not Humboldt State, because science is the currency of the moment, right? So there are several problems around this, and I really recommend Vanessa Machado de Oliveira's book, Hospicing Modernity, because her analysis of how the sciences have messed up what's happening in sustainability education is so good. It's so good. But one of the things she argues is that because of the fact that education produces these scientists, they are, whether they mean to or not, generally speaking, embroiled in a market colonial economy, right? So the questions that they ask, the problem closure that they come up with, those things are dictated by where the dollars are coming from, in essence, right? I was just talking to Anthony earlier, I'm like, I don't want to do any grants because that money is tainted, So, that's a privilege that I get to choose not to do by doing these talks instead, right? So science has to be considered from the context that produce it and the power that it serves. And also, as a result of that, it has also been asked to be objective and not subjective, right? So there's an epistemological assumption within science that says we're going to do things with the scientific method and human emotion gets in the way. And this is a result of Cartesian dualistic thought that says that you can't have effective policy or rational thought if emotions are getting in your way. And so for the vast majority of scientists who I talk to, they're asking me, I've just spent my entire career eliminating emotion from what I do. And now you're telling me to try to bring it back into the classroom. How do I do that when it's so suspect? And so that's a really critical question for, I think, the leaders in climate science to be asking. Yeah, and there's a lot of change that can happen along those two lines in terms of how the epistemological power of the sciences operates in society and how you might use that power to kind of change the conditions, and also the centering of emotions. I think those actually go together. I don't know if that answered your question, but it is like a good, big, broad question. So it could go a lot of different directions. Thank you.
One question here and then over here.
So being in Humboldt County, I know a family friend of ours right now is currently camping out in the redwoods, trying to stop PGE from taking down trees. And I was wondering if you've kind of read into that or looked at that as part of your teachings and writings in your classes. About
direct action?
Yeah, and especially the one that's happening in your area right now.
Yeah, I should know about it, and I'm sorry to say I don't actually know about that. Partly because I'm on leave, so I don't know what my students are doing. What are they doing out there? I don't know. Okay, so direct action. Well, can I speak to it in the general? Yeah. So one of the things, and then there is a specific I can get to that has to do with wind farms, which is a similar direct action that happened recently in Humboldt County. a lot of times, I think what happens with, where do I want to start with this? One of the things I noticed when I was describing that circa 2013 moment where my students were despairing was that they felt very much like they didn't have the patience to sit in chairs in classrooms and do like academic reading and discussion. And does any of that feel familiar to anybody? Like, this shit's burning, we gotta get out there and fix it, right? So there's a sense of impatience and urgency that was driving them out of the classroom, right? I can't sit here, it's too depressing, I'm having anxiety sitting here not doing anything. So there's a real sense of desire for action, right? So the response initially to that, I think, by a lot of educators was to build action into classrooms as a solution, right? But I would go to a whole other set of questions, which is the work that has to happen when you're not in a state of urgency of thinking through whose voices are getting included and excluded in the action. Is the action the most skillful action? What action is going to be the most effective and efficient at pressing some leverage points of change, like Donella Meadows talked about? That takes some thinking and work. That takes some historical knowledge. That takes some theorizing. That takes discussion, relationship building, consensus building, coalition building. It's not like just going to scratch the dopamine hit of your anxiety by taking action. A lot of people talk about transform your anxiety into action. You know, by taking action, you won't feel that anxiety anymore. And from a psychologist perspective, and even from a mindfulness perspective, that's just regulatory. It doesn't actually solve the problem. It just makes us feel better. So there's a real invitation there to step back and say, what is this doing for me? Why do I need to do this? What actions would affect the change I want to see? Let's get strategic about my energy, because that is a recipe for burnout. Just building any old action into your classroom, Christchurch was an action, right? Action is not inherently positive or inherently non-harming, right? So in our, going out there with action, are we actually reducing harms, right? So there's some thought that is required in that. However, assuming you've done all that work, and then you figure out what actions to take, I'm thinking here of Joanna Macy's work on the work that reconnects. She talks about 3 components of what she calls the story of the great turning. So Joanna Macy's saying, we live in 3 stories of now. We live in the story of the great unraveling, where everything's going to hell in a handbasket, which is the story most of us live in, right? We think that's truth. Then there's the story of the business as usual, which is let's just keep on going, keep on shopping. It's like George Bush after 9/11. Just shop, get the economy going again, denial of the root causes of these problems, right? And then there's the story of what she calls the great turning, which is the groundswell of millions of people around the planet who are doing this unglamorous, unspectacular, not newsworthy work to change the world for the better, right? And she says in that category of the great turning, there's 3 kinds of work that can be done. One is direct action. One is to go immediately to disrupt the systems, right in their tracks. But that can't happen without all this other stuff, too. So you are a direct action person, that's awesome. But don't think that that's the only thing that's going to fix the problem. Thank goodness you have this whole team of other people doing other things, too. Right? This has to do with thinking of ourselves as an acquirer and not individuals, right? And also, I think among my students anyway, there's a lot of, I'm going to go fix the problem better than you're going to go fix the problem. I'm going to go become a politician and you're just an artist. How are you going to fix it? Right? There's this kind of like competition about this way is the right way and that's why I'm choosing it. And there's a real moment of opportunity for humility. Oh, this is a collective effort. This particular leverage point I'm going to push here needs to happen in concert with that one that you're going to push over there. Because we actually magnify sum is greater than the parts of that work. And that is what the great turning is. Actually, Adrienne Maree Brown calls that emergence strategy. That's how her definition of emergence. So yeah, that doesn't answer PG&E and Humboldt, but I'll go look into it. Thanks.
I know earlier in your talk, you mentioned in your book you discuss death as a big part of it.
Yeah. Back there, death person. No, he's writing something. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
And I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail of like what sort of conversations you bring up about death and how it is important to discuss and talk about.
Oh, wow. You want to go there? Okay, I'm going to try it out. I'm going to try it out. Thank you for that courage to ask that question. I bet a lot of you have thoughts about this that are pretty well formulated. Yeah. Maybe you can speak too. Yeah, you want to go?
Yeah, what was the question?
Death. Yeah.
So it's like, what do we do about the anxiety of, the fact that we're dead?
How do you bring death into the question? Why is death part of the conversation?
It's something that everybody should kind of come to terms with coping, and most of them do it differently. So it's like a really easy topic to bring up. It's like, oh shit.
You think about it. You're like, okay, I'm not gonna live forever. I could talk to my family about it. Most people have. So when I meet a friend and we get comfortable enough, I'm like, yo, what do you think? How does it make you feel? Are you comfortable enough to talk about it? And a good 65% of the time, it's a no.
Yeah.
And then, the other 45%, it's all over the spectrum. People have opinions.
Yeah.
They have beliefs that, calm their anxieties, or they just don't know, like me, and they're just living, trying to make the world better every day at a time.
Yeah. Thank you. So, I find the first thing I'll say is that talking, just as you were talking about this in the back there, bringing up death with college-age students is usually doesn't go very far. So it's like the last thing I do. So I'm like, oh my God, I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable right now with y'all talking about death, because most people your age don't want to talk about it. So that's my first thing, like, okay, let's talk about death. You asked, so I'm going to do it. But so there's a whole philosophy of people who would say this, including indigenous thinkers, including James Baldwin, who said, if white people would just face their own fear of death, we wouldn't be in this problem, right? So there's a direct link being made by lots of theorists that say that the vast majority of harms that people do in the world are actually a result of their fear of death. So that's the first kind of response, right? So then if fear of death is the cause and not like just capitalism, it's like a bigger ask, I mean, capitalism was a pretty big ask to begin with, but like fear of death feels like even bigger. So there's a particular form of thinking coming out of Ernst Becker's work called terror management theory, TMT. So if you're interested in this orientation, a whole field of scholarly production is happening around it. That terror management theory is why we do everything we do, right? We're trying to manage our terror, manage our fear of mortality. And of course, mainstream American culture fetishizes youth, fetishizes permanence, stasis, right? All this stuff. And so the notion that that's an evidence that American society fears death, right, is very high. But there are many traditions that don't have that same fear of death, and for whom this notion of impermanence and ephemerality and the humility that comes with it, the awareness of your sense in a collective that comes with it, the ancestor principle that comes with it, actually opens up the possibility for a much more ethical orientation to others and the more than human world. So there's an argument to be made that the more we reckon with our own fear of mortality, the less harm we do in the world and the more humble we are in the world. That's a really, But you got people like Roy Scranton, who wrote this book, How to Die in the Anthropocene, where he talks about how he was in Afghanistan and thought he was going to die every day. So he did this, ancient practice of imagining his own death every day. And he says, that got me through, ironically. That got me through. My mental health was saved because of that. And that's what we need to do around climate change. And people like Joan Halifax and people in a lot of Buddhist traditions would say, yeah, actually, ironically or paradoxically, once we accept the fact, we have this sort of acceptance of impermanence of all this stuff, we realize how much we're attached to and grasping. Maybe if we stop grasping so much, we would actually be more effective in our work. So there's a lot of places to go on that, I do a death practice every day, yeah. Yeah, oh, sorry, yeah.
We got here and then there. I think, was it a follow-up question? Totally separate question? Yeah. Okay, we'll go here first and then to you next. And then
That's a tough question, man. I'm feeling all like, ooh, sharing that stuff. Okay.
Well, I just wanted the opportunity to comment on this question as well. I think
Yeah,
the
thank
conversation
you.
around death in regards to climate change is also really important for the conceptualization of kind of like manslaughter, like the unintentional cause of death for other people around the world. And I think that's related to this topic because a lot of people feel responsible, right? This sense of urgency, like you need to do something or people are going to die, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And we've been having a conversation in class about like the concept of neutrality too. And if you're neutral on an issue, you're complicit in the harm of others, right? And I think that is also a really huge cause of climate anxiety because a lot of individuals feel like they're responsible for the deaths that are occurring from their inaction or the feeling that even if they're doing something, it's not enough.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, connect that. That's not related necessarily to death, or it is?
I mean, it is, because
Yeah,
like,
okay.
you feel responsible for others' death.
Oh, I
right?
see.
And as
Oh,
well as
yeah.
the death of the environment.
Got it. Yes. No, I'm with you. Thank you. So I was like, oh, connect. Yes, totally. Wow. Okay. Yes, to everything you said. Absolutely. Right. So I'm currently reading a book called Mourning in the Anthropocene, Grief and Mourning in the Anthropocene. I recommend it, I think. I am only 2 chapters in, so I haven't gone there yet. And the premise of his argument in this book is that if we don't learn that grief is actually an invitation to care and to do more stuff to protect stuff. Ironically, the capacity to grieve and to anticipate loss makes us do better actions to protect that which we fear is being lost that we love, right? So some people talk about how grief is actually a signal to what we love, right? There's all kinds of theories around grief out there. But this notion that in most dominant mainstream American culture, grief is kind of considered like there's a stigma to it, right? And that you're sort of like people waiting for you to get out of it, right? And that it doesn't have a utility politically, that it's something you do privately because it gets in the way of your productivity or whatever, right? So his argument on the contrary is if we do not have that capacity to anticipate loss or experience loss, that we won't do the necessary actions required to protect the stuff that we love. That has a direct connection to your point, right? Which is that one of the ways that denial operates is a response to cognitive dissonance, right? That we're going about our lives acting in all these ways that we come to learn through our education and through learning how everything's interconnected, that we're causing all this harm even when we don't intend it, right? Without malice, we're just doing it. And that creates, in a lot of my students anyway, and myself included, a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so denial is actually the elegant solution cognitively to deal with that. And so opening up to the pain of facing that is a necessary prerequisite. Some people argue, and I'm toying with that myself because I don't really want to feel that either. You know, I got on an airplane to come see y'all today, right? And I'm like, oh God, you know? So, yeah, we don't, in American culture, there is a real aversion to what we call uncomfortable or distressful emotions. And there aren't rituals around it. There aren't, sanctioned spaces for that, for the most part. Some of us come from cultures or families that have that, but as a culture, predominantly in America, it's not happening. Yeah, and I could go on about that, but I don't know. You were sort of making the argument, and I just agree with that, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Do you mind if I go through the different topics? Or do you really want to ask it?
It's not even a question, it's just if I want to add on to this.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really important. It was just shocking to me that you said that especially college students don't want to talk about death, because I feel like, especially for myself, and I really don't want to speak for anybody else, but I guess for myself and at least my friend groups, we have been having this conversation about death since I was 14, so it's like not even in college.
Wow.
I've been having like conversations about death, my mortality, surrounding the topic of climate change for a very long time, because I think especially, again, I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think for my generation, we're faced with our mortality in a way that is very in our face, in a way that we're told we can't have kids because the planet's dying and all this very in our face, like the planet's dying kind of thing. So it creates this like depressing mentality of what's the point, what's the future. So it's like death is very much, I feel like, constantly on our faces. It's why we're in college almost, because so many of us are like, if we don't go to college, we're all gonna die. If we don't fix the system, we're all gonna die. So it's like, I feel like I'm just shocked. So that's why I really was like, I wanna point that out, that I feel like I'm shocked that people aren't, talking about it, because I feel like in my circles, it's a huge point.
I'm so glad that you said that. Thanks, Anthony, for giving her a chance to add that. Yeah, maybe those two things are not as opposing as we think, right? Maybe it's just too hard to go there for the very reasons that you talked about. It's just in your cells, right? And this is the everyone talks about a generation, right? Like every generation has their issue. And I remember when I first started talking about this issue with my students and climate change 10 years ago or so, and older people would say to me, well, we had the Holocaust, or we had Vietnam, and I'm not comparing them at all. But I kept thinking, well, it raises a question, is there something uniquely awful about this moment for my students, or are they just waking up to their generation's problem? And I mean, I know where I land on that now, today, and you spoke to it beautifully, that this is why I try to make the case that this is the climate generation, right? This is a generation that has death in the next 12 years, according to the last IPCC report, right? So this sort of like tick-tock, the Jeopardy thing going on, like this is how much time we have left, is existential, absolutely. And I honor and respect and thank you for bringing that up. I would love to think that somehow that reality that I do believe that my students are feeling actually could translate into actually talking vulnerably about it in class. Maybe I'll try that next time. Because when I bring it up, I sometimes, death, and everyone goes, and I'm okay, maybe they don't want to talk about it. That's how it kind of goes, But I think if with more intention and care, it could be done. Yeah. Thanks.
Can we do one more?
Yeah, I'm here. Like I said, I got on the plane, so still working.
You sort of mentioned this climate change being our generation's problem and tying it back into the Holocaust and Vietnam. Do you think that violent or destructive resistance has any place in this, or is that something that at all costs should be avoided?
Specifically, what are you talking about?
Things like, partisans destroying infrastructure that cause damage, things like that.
Yeah, ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I do think it has a role. And also, I am a very firm believer in nonviolent action, right? So infrastructure is different than humans, right? Yeah. This goes back to the earlier question over here about direct action. And I do think civil disobedience and direct action are extremely effective and necessary. But they're one part of a larger theory of change that I support my students developing skills in a lot of these other areas. And my personal favorite is the mindset one, but that's mine, right? You might be like, no, my skill set's over here. I'm gonna go do that, right? This is what I was saying earlier about being in concert, being in a larger, what Paul Hawken calls a blessed unrest of people around the world that are doing that work. We could not have gotten where we have gotten with climate justice in the White House if Standing Rock had not happened, if various forms of disruption had not happened. Britain would be in a very different place with climate change politics if we didn't see what was happening with Extinction Rebellion there. So there's arguably that these actions and social movements, as ephemeral as they sometimes are, have changed the conversation, which have changed politics. Because people in politics are just the weather vane, right? That's Rebecca Solnit's argument, right? It's not power over and power down. It's not top down. These people are just going with the wind, right? And then who creates the wind and the weather that they're telltale signs of? It's society, it's the grassroots, it's the groundswell, right? So yeah, those things have changed up top because of generations of people doing work to change minds and actions, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming out.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody, and especially thanks to Professor Sarah Ray for joining us. There'll be another lecture in week 7, which is February 22nd at 11:30. I think we'll be moving to a smaller lecture hall in the same building. But Professor Kari Norgard and her close collaborator, Ron Reed, will be here to talk about a number of things related to Indigenous climate activism and adaptation. So please join us for that. But thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Have a good rest of your day.